There is a place on the eastern edge of New Orleans where the laughter stopped all at once. The gates are chained, the ticket booths are empty, and the roller coasters stand rusting against a wide Louisiana sky. Weeds push through the cracked pavement of a midway that once smelled of funnel cake and summer. For more than a decade, this amusement park sat frozen in time, drowned by a storm, and then simply forgotten. Nature crept back in slowly, patiently, reclaiming everything the engineers had built. What was meant to be a place of joy became one of the most haunting abandoned parks in America. This is the story of a dream that opened with fireworks and closed beneath floodwater. This is the story of Six Flags New Orleans and the hurricane that left it to sink into silence. The story begins not with tragedy, but with ambition. In the late 1990s, the city of New Orleans wanted a world-class amusement park to call its own, something that could draw families and tourists beyond the French Quarter. Developers chose a large tract of low-lying land in New Orleans East, near the shore of Lake Pontchartrain. The park was christened Jazzland, a name meant to celebrate the music, the culture, and the soul of the city itself. Themed districts evoked the Mardi Gras Carnival, the Bayou, and Old New Orleans. When it opened to the public in the year 2000, there was genuine hope that it would become a landmark. Ribbons were cut, crowds streamed through the gates, and for a brief and shining moment, the future looked bright and full of promise out on the flat, low eastern flats of the city. Jazzland was designed to feel like a celebration of Louisiana itself. Guests wandered through districts inspired by the French Quarter, the Cajun Bayou, and the pageantry of Mardi Gras, each corner dressed in wrought iron balconies and vibrant color. At the heart of the park stood a towering wooden roller coaster, a rattling giant that carried riders high above the flat coastal plain. There were spinning rides, a carousel, a log flume, and the constant hum of arcade games and midway music. Concession stands served regional flavors, and cover bands filled the air with brass and rhythm. For local families, it was a place to spend a hot summer afternoon close to home, without driving hours to another state. In those first seasons, Jazzland embodied a hopeful vision, a homegrown attraction built to give New Orleans a joyful landmark all its own. But building a park is one thing, and keeping it alive is another. Despite the celebration and the fanfare, Jazzland struggled to find firm financial footing in its earliest years. Attendance and revenue did not always meet the lofty expectations of its planners, and the park changed hands as it searched for stability. In 2002, the Six Flags Corporation, one of the largest amusement park operators in the world, stepped in to take over operations. With their involvement came new investment, new marketing muscle, and the promise of famous branded attractions. For 2003, the park was rebranded and reopened under a new name that carried instant recognition across the country. Jazzland, the local dream, was folded into a national empire. The hope was that the Six Flags name and its resources could finally make the park thrive where the original vision had stumbled. Under the Six Flags banner, the park entered its brief heyday. New rides arrived, including a steel coaster themed around a caped comic book hero, its inverted track twisting riders through loops high above the ground. The wooden coaster continued to roar, and new attractions were added to draw thrill seekers of every age. Costumed characters roamed the walkways, fireworks lit the summer nights, and the park settled into the familiar rhythm of a regional Six Flags destination. Season passes were sold, school groups arrived by the busload, and for a few years, the eastern edge of New Orleans had a genuine amusement park humming with life. It was never the busiest park in the chain, but it was theirs, woven into the summers of countless Louisiana families. No one walking those midways in the summer of 2005 imagined how few days the park had left. The park's fatal weakness was hidden in plain sight, written into the very ground on which it stood. New Orleans East sits low, much of it at or below sea level, ringed and crossed by levees meant to hold back the water. The park was protected by these earthen and concrete walls, part of a vast system that made the city livable at all. For generations, that system had mostly held, and residents lived their lives trusting the barriers around them. But engineers and scientists had long warned that a powerful enough storm could overwhelm those defenses. The land remembered that it had once been swamp and marsh, and water has a long memory. In late August of 2005, out in the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, that theoretical danger began to take a terrible and unmistakable shape. It formed far out over the ocean, a swirl of cloud that quickly grew into something monstrous. Hurricane Katrina intensified over the Gulf into one of the most powerful storms of its era, its winds spiraling for hundreds of miles. Forecasters watched with mounting dread as its projected path bent toward Louisiana and the vulnerable bowl of New Orleans. Officials issued urgent warnings, and eventually a mandatory evacuation emptied much of the city onto clogged highways heading north. The amusement park, like everything else in New Orleans East, was shuttered and left behind. Rides were locked down, gates were closed, and staff fled with everyone else. As the last cars streamed slowly out of the emptying city, the park stood entirely alone in the gathering wind, its coasters and carousels waiting silently for a blow that no one could yet fully imagine. On the 29th of August, 2005, Katrina came ashore along the Gulf Coast with catastrophic force. The winds tore at rooftops and signs, and the storm surge drove seawater inland with unstoppable pressure. In New Orleans, the true disaster was not only the wind, but what came after it. Under the strain of the surge, the levees and flood walls protecting the city failed in multiple places, breaching and collapsing. Water poured through the gaps and into the low neighborhoods below, filling them like a basin. Across the city, thousands of homes vanished beneath the rising flood, and the human tragedy that unfolded became one of the worst disasters in American history. New Orleans East, where the amusement park stood on its low ground, lay directly in the path of that spreading inland flood. As the water rose higher and higher, the park slowly began to disappear beneath it. When the storm finally passed, the park was gone beneath a still, brown sea. Floodwater submerged the grounds, in places reaching several feet deep, swallowing the lower rides, the shops, and the walkways whole. The carousel horses stood knee-deep in murky water. The bumper cars floated in their flooded arena. Because the surrounding land sat so low, the water did not simply drain away. It lingered for weeks, a stagnant lake baking under the late summer sun, saturated with salt, mud, and everything the flood had carried in. Metal began to corrode almost immediately, and the brackish water ate into the machinery, the wiring, and the structures. By the time the flood at last receded, the damage was total and irreversible. What emerged from the receding water was no longer an amusement park, but a ruined, poisoned shell, coated in a thick skin of drying muck. In the aftermath, the numbers told a hopeless story. The floodwater had sat for so long, and the corrosion was so severe, that restoring the park to working order was deemed impossible for any reasonable cost. Nearly all of the rides were considered damaged beyond repair, poisoned by saltwater, and rust down to their bones. The electrical systems were destroyed, the buildings were structurally compromised, and mold bloomed across every surface. Six Flags, itself facing enormous financial pressure in the years that followed, made the decision not to rebuild. The company would ultimately part ways with the crippled property, and the lease that had bound them to the land came to an end. The park that had opened with fireworks just a few years earlier would never sell another ticket. It was, from that point on, simply abandoned, left standing exactly where the flood had ruined it. And so began the long silence. With no owner willing to restore it, and no clear plan to tear it down, the park entered a strange limbo that would stretch on for years. The gates stayed locked, but nature did not wait for permission. Grass and vines pushed up through the pavement, swallowing benches and fences, and small trees took root where crowds had once lined up for rides. Louisiana's heat and humidity accelerated the decay, softening wood, spreading rust, and cracking concrete. The bright paint faded to chalky pastels under the relentless sun. Alligators and snakes moved into the flooded low spots and drainage canals, making the ruins genuinely dangerous. Season after season, the park sank deeper into ruin, a rotting monument standing at the edge of a city that was itself struggling to rebuild. It became a place the living had abandoned to the wild. The wooden roller coaster, once the pride of the park, became a skeleton against the sky. Its timbers weathered and warped, its track sagging where the supports had rotted, until it looked less like a ride and more like the bones of some enormous beast. The steel coasters rusted a deep orange, their trains left stranded on the tracks. The tall observation and drop rides stood motionless, streaked with rust and stained by years of rain. Signs that once shouted cheerful invitations peeled and dangled, their letters half gone. Everywhere, the machinery of joy had seized up and gone quiet. Water still pooled in the low places, dark and green with algae, reflecting the ruined shapes above it. To stand within the empty park was to stand inside a photograph of a summer that had ended abruptly and never resumed, arrested forever at the moment the water rose. Word of the drowned park spread, and it drew a particular kind of visitor. Urban explorers, photographers, and thrill-seekers began slipping past the fences to document the ruins, despite the site being closed, guarded, and genuinely hazardous. They came for the haunting beauty of it, the surreal sight of roller coasters, strangled by weeds, and a flooded midway going quietly back to swamp. Their photographs circulated widely online, and the park became a kind of legend among those fascinated by abandoned places. Images of the graffiti-covered walls, the rusted rides, and the silent carousel spread across the internet, cementing its reputation as one of the eeriest abandoned sites in the country. Trespassing there was illegal and dangerous, with unstable structures, hidden hazards, and wildlife lurking in the water. Yet the pull of the place was strong, a ruined wonderland that seemed to exist in a world entirely of its own. The park's ruined grandeur soon caught the eye of Hollywood. Filmmakers discovered that they had, sitting at the edge of New Orleans, a ready-made post-apocalyptic landscape that no set designer could hope to recreate. The decayed midway, the rusted rides, and the overgrown pathways offered a haunting backdrop for stories of ruin and collapse. Over the years, the site was used as a filming location for major feature films and television productions, its skeletal coasters and flooded grounds standing in for worlds gone wrong. Crews arrived where crowds once had, transforming the ghost park into a stage for imagined catastrophes. In an ironic twist, a place destroyed by a real disaster earned a second life portraying fictional ones. For a few weeks at a time, the park was full of activity again, before falling silent once more when the cameras and crews packed up and left the ruins behind. Meanwhile, on paper, the park was constantly on the verge of rebirth. In the years after Katrina, a long parade of developers, investors, and city officials floated plans to do something with the property. There were proposals to rebuild it as a new amusement park, to transform it into an outlet shopping mall, to convert it into a water park, a film studio, or a mixed-use development. Renderings were unveiled, press conferences were held, and hopeful headlines promised that the eyesore would finally be reborn. But one after another, the plans collapsed. Financing fell through, negotiations stalled, and the sheer cost of clearing and rebuilding the ruined site scared away those who dreamed of reviving it. Years passed with the park caught between demolition and redevelopment, belonging to no clear future. Each new proposal raised hopes among locals, and each quiet failure let the ruins slip deeper into decay. Slowly, piece by piece, parts of the park began to disappear. Some of the salvageable rides were sold off or removed, dismantled and hauled away to be scrapped or relocated. Demolition crews eventually took down structures that had grown too dangerous to leave standing, and the once proud wooden coaster was among the landmarks brought low. What the flood had ruined, the wrecking equipment finished, clearing sections of the grounds down to bare, weed-choked earth. Yet the demolition never quite happened all at once, and for a long time the park existed in a half-erased state, some rides gone, others still rusting in place. It was neither fully preserved nor fully destroyed, a ruin being slowly unmade. Watching it come down, longtime residents felt a complicated grief, mourning not just a park but a piece of the New Orleans that had existed before the storm, changed everything. To walk the grounds in those late years was to move through a landscape of small, aching details. A child's ride sat rusted and still, its cheerful animals faded to ghostly outlines. Cash registers, tickets, and paperwork lay scattered and mildewed where they had been dropped in the rush to evacuate, untouched for years. Flooded gift shops still held rotting merchandise on collapsing shelves. The great clown face that had once smiled over one of the park's attractions became an icon of the ruins, its grin now cracked and unsettling amid the desolation. Nature had woven itself through every